Welcome to 15 Minutes of Feminism, part of our On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine platform. As you know, we are a show that reports with bells, and we always tell it just as it is. And in this terrific episode, I am joined by Professor Leah Litman, who is the co-host of the exemplary podcast called Strict Scrutiny. We love our time with those hosts. And in this episode, we're talking about Leah's new book called Lawless, how the Supreme Court runs on conservative grievance, fringe theories, and bad vibes. So sit back and take a listen to this great episode with Professor Leah Litman.
Leah, it's always a pleasure to be with you. You're a great friend and forever a colleague, even if we're at different academic institutions. You've written a really powerful book, Lawless, how the Supreme Court runs on conservative grievance, fringe theories, and bad vibes. I love the title.
Took a while to workshop it.
I get to the substance of this great work, but tell us a little bit about this title.
Yeah, so I have a podcast, Strict Scrutiny, and we cover the Supreme Court. And in the course of covering the Supreme Court and all of the craziness that those guys do, one time I remarked on one of their opinions, it was no law, just vibes. And so really the conceit and origin for the book was how the Republican justices aren't doing law and they are instead running on vibes. And so from there, it kind of crystallized into expanding, well, what are the vibes they're running on? And that's the conservative grievance element. And then Lawless seemed like a very short, punchy way of describing the thing the court isn't doing that most people hope or expect that they are.
You know, this book, it's so accessible, right? So everybody should run out and get a copy, because what you've done is to translate some very high ideas to ways in which everybody's concerned about, the way in which the informed and the lesser informed American public and non-American public are concerned. All eyes, not to be navel gazing, but eyes are on the United States given the gravity of what's been taking shape just even in these early months of the second Trump administration. And so of the book, it's really accessible. There are 5 chapters, and I actually want us to start not with chapter 1, but chapter 4, which is There's Always Money in America, which is what many people come to believe. And here's something that I want to just read from the beginning of chapter 4. The Republican justices, you write, have repeatedly shown that they are more than a little out of touch, both with reality and other people. You are hilarious. For example, you note that in June 2023, ProPublica was preparing to run a story on Justice Samuel Alito's luxury Alaskan vacation with hedge fund billionaire and Republican donor Paul Singer, and that Alito's trip featured a free ride in Singer's private jet and a $1,000 bottle of wine. Now, at this point, some folks from the Federalist Society might be saying, you're petty, Leah. You are so petty to be pulling out the $1,000 bottle of wine. But there is a reason why you're talking about this matter of money in the court and the justices and what that ProPublica story is all about. Can you shed light on that?
Yeah, so I think this story nicely encapsulates several things that are happening with the Supreme Court. One is just the rich sense of entitlement that some of the justices have, because of course, as ProPublica was getting ready to run this story, Justice Alito runs off to the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal to protest that they are being unfair to him. And the idea that it is unfair to a powerful public political official to report on some of the gifts and largesse being bestowed on them by people who are basically purchasing access to those officials, I think should be striking to most people. That is a form of accountability. That is not some unfair treatment, a hit piece. So that's one aspect of it. The second is just the utter ridiculousness of some of his response. So you noted that there had been reports that the trip involved a $1,000 bottle of wine. And Justice Alito literally says, if there was wine, it certainly wasn't $1,000 bottle of wine, as if, right, like it's an insult to him, to be misdescribing the value of the wine. And he would know whether it was $1,000 bottle of wine, and you poors just wouldn't. And
But it doesn't signify well in one direction
no.
or the other, right? It doesn't signify well in the I know a $10,000 bottle of wine and this certainly didn't add up. And it doesn't signify in another direction either.
No, I mean, like if you're getting a free private jet trip and a free $100 bottle of wine, that's still bad too, Justice Alito. And so just the silliness of the response, the pettiness of the response, and how it shows, I think, nicely this cloistered universe that the Republican justices have come to occupy, where they are insulated from the worst consequences of their decisions because they have these people propping up this false reality almost around them where they're doing amazing, they're doing awesome, and so they're welcome on these free private jet trips. And this is just a stunning picture of one of the three branches of the federal government.
I think that you are telling a story about how so many of these problems are rooted within American law and our courts. So you reference, for example, in the early 1800s, Alexis de Tocqueville coming to the United States famously, and then writing about and recording that trip. And you mentioned, quote, if you ask me, he wrote, where I place the American aristocracy, I would answer without hesitating. The American aristocracy is at the lawyer's bar and on the judge's bench. Wow, Leah.
Yeah. So that was written, 200 years ago. And I think what's striking is this was something de Tocqueville observed, right? The C's were already there in the structure of our government. And part of what I hope to show in the book is how much worse it's become over time as the justices have accumulated more and more power, as they insist they are above the law because they are the law, and who are you to question them? And to suggest that, again, someone looking at this from the outside would recognize, why would you have a system where, in effect, these 9 unelected individuals operate like kings? That is not how a liberal constitutional democracy should run.
So you take us from there to really helping us to unpack how the court has had its hand in the cookie jar, the hand in the financial jar, the coin jar. Maybe I should, coins for the listeners right there. Tell us about that, this history, so that people understand it as something that is not just a creation of these times, but that actually this legacy has some texture throughout the centuries. And there are a few cases that you mentioned along that way.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you pointed that out, because a big part of the book is, of course, trying to show that while things are very bad now, it's not like the Supreme Court has been great for all of the other times. In fact, many of the ridiculous and appalling things the justices are doing today have pretty clear callbacks to things the court and its justices have done before. So in this specific chapter on economic inequality, I focus on decisions really in the early 1900s that became fixated on this idea that when state legislatures or Congress tried to address economic inequality by, say, leveling the playing field between the haves and the have-nots, the Supreme Court became obsessed with this idea that that was unfair discrimination against the rich because it was taking away something from them that they deserve, that they were entitled to. And it was giving the have-nots something they were not entitled to because they couldn't get it for themselves on the free market. And that kind of obliviousness, of course, overlooked how laws created the conditions for markets at the time, right, to be grossly unequal as far as forcing employees to work in horrific conditions and not allowing them to have the collective bargaining power to negotiate with their employees or to negotiate with their employers for better conditions and better wages. And so it's that kernel, this idea that, well, the rich, they're just entitled to do what they want with their money and power because they're so deserving. And any efforts to equalize the playing field are unfair to them and give the have-nots something they do not deserve, that I trace not only to those early 1900s cases, but also to the modern cases that dismantle campaign finance regulation. I see the same ideas there too.
So tell us about that. And in fact, you include the famous camera turn towards Justice Alito when Barack Obama is president. And he's talking about one of those cases that you mentioned, and Alito mouths "not true," and cameras catch it, right? It's this very interesting show where many people are like, "What a show of disrespect that the justice is showing towards, President Obama." It's a kind of subtle showdown, but it's a case that actually has significant consequences in real time.
So the case you're referring to is, of course, Citizens United versus FEC. That case struck down the federal law that limited corporations, including, nonprofit corporations like political action committees, from spending their own money to make their own advertisements, on behalf of candidates. So rather than donating money to candidates, they would create their own ads, run their own print pieces, make their own videos in order to advocate for or against a particular client. And in Citizens United, 5 Republican justices said it is unconstitutional for Congress to restrict corporations' ability to spend their own money advocating for or against political candidates because, they suggested, when Congress is doing that, it is trying to equalize the playing field in a way that they just can't do. And the court also, in its obliviousness, insisted that massive amounts of spending, even from corporations, would not lead to corruption or even the appearance of corruption. And it's that kind of obliviousness, of course, that we also saw in Justice Alito's response to the reporting about his trip to Alaska, and in the obliviousness of the Supreme Court in the early 1930s, right, in insisting that, well, of course, legislation, right, that tries to equalize the playing field, that's giving something to the have-nots they don't deserve. And so Citizens United is very much of a piece with this. And then after Citizens United, many people warned about the consequences for our elections and political spending in a world where there would be unrestricted corporate spending. And one of those people, of course, was then President Barack Obama, who warned that the Supreme Court had opened the door to unlimited spending in elections. And it was at that moment where Justice Alito shakes his head and mouths "not true," of course, because he cannot handle any criticism of him or even honestly accurate statements about what he did. Right.
Even blames, like toss your wife under the bus. But, to what you're raising there, and then now fast forward, look at what we've seen in the last presidential election. Look at what we've seen in the election involving the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Leah, weigh in on it. I know that your manuscript was in as all of this was going on, but tell us something about this, Leah. Obama was right.
Yes. Oh, no, he was completely right. And I am thankful that I at least had the opportunity to add some lines to the manuscript after the most recent presidential election in 2024, because, of course, we saw in that race, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, pour several hundreds of millions of dollars into the cause of electing Donald Trump. And the idea that one person can spend that much money is striking. And it is exactly the kind of thing that President Obama and others warned about. Because, of course, when you spend that amount of money, you are purchasing a kind of influence and access that everyone else cannot get. I mean, Elon Musk was able to sit in on meetings about possible appointments, within the Trump administration. He was sitting in on meetings with foreign leaders. He is, in and around the White House all the time. He apparently has this massive amounts of roving authority over the federal government. And that's the kind of corruption, or at least appearance of corruption, that Congress was trying to address when it restricted unlimited political spending, including unlimited political spending by corporations. And the Supreme Court just denied that it existed and created the circumstances that allowed the richest man in the world to spend his way to being a shadow president.
So I want us to turn to another aspect of your book, because the title is great, and throughout it, folks can just say, Leah's tossing shade. Professor Litman is just great at shade and serving up the tea. And you do that. It's not just in the title, but it's in the pages here. One of the things that you mention is that even though they represent a minority of the country, Republicans remain more politically powerful than ever. You said at a tally a month after the 2020 presidential election that Donald Trump legitimately lost, Trump told attendees, quote, "We're all victims. Everybody here. Apparently, democracy itself is now unfair." And I want to unpack this a little bit more about Republicans and power and just where we stand in this country, because there's just so much there. And I can't help but think about, and you turn to aspects of this in chapter 1, the Ken-surrection of the courts. And I'm thinking about Roe v. Wade as the first place to start, and thinking about the transition over time and what it means. Republicans in power, Democrats in power, money and influence, because Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision. And 5 of those 7 justices were Republican appointed. Justice Blackmun, who wrote the opinion in Roe, was put on the court by Richard Nixon. Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. And so now fast forward, 50, 60 years from that time, not even 60 years from that time, like just 52 years from the time of Roe. Now you've written a book that really, makes it really square that there are very strong economic interests that are tied to the Republican Party, that are wielding power like never before. And I'm wondering whether we can even call Republicans now Republicans anymore as a start.
Yeah, it certainly seems as if there is a different breed that is present in politics now. And I think that that's where the part of the subtitle alluding to fringe theories comes in, because part of what the book is describing is how the Republican Party and Republican officials have become comfortable basically appealing to and representing an increasingly narrow segment of the American public. And part of what has allowed them to do so is, one, the kind of infrastructure of our constitutional democracy, but also, second, the fact that they then use any power they have to make it easier for them to rule by minority. So on the infrastructure, of course, we have the Electoral College and the Senate system. Electoral College allows someone who doesn't win the popular vote to obtain the presidency. The Senate, that system allows a group of senators, to vote for legislation, a majority of them, even though they don't represent a majority of the American people. And of course, those two institutions select who is on the Supreme Court. And so it's almost like this, matryoshka doll of minority rule, where there are all of these additional layers of minority rule that have been built into the system and become even worse, just given demographic trends, where people live and whatnot. So that's part of the story. But the other part is, whenever Republicans now are in power, they try to make it easier for them to win elections, even when they don't win a majority of the vote. So one of the examples I point to is the story of the North Carolina Supreme Court, which of course we're continuing to see play out now. But that court used to be a majority of progressive justices. It flipped control over a series of elections to a majority of Republican-affiliated justices. What were the first things that court did once it became Republican-controlled? Reinstated a voter identification requirement and said the state legislature got to keep their partisan gerrymander. Both of those laws, partisan gerrymanders and voter IDs, allow the Republican Party to win elections, even though they might not win a majority of votes and eligible voters. And so this is also happening, of course, at the United States Supreme Court and elsewhere, but it has just become this fixation of the Republican Party to be committed to minority rule and to try to cement avenues for minority rule.
In the Ken-surrection, and I'd love for you to unpack the Ken-surrection, but you mentioned that now the Supreme Court is packed with a bunch of Kens. You say the Supreme Court's decision to eliminate women's right to reproductive freedom was a Ken-surrection, a move to restore a patriarchy where men are on top, and that overruling Roe was just the opening salvo in the fight. And it was not just happening in Barbie land. And you cite to Gerwig's 2023 film, but that these are matters that are happening every day. They're running through people's lives. They're here with us, and there's more that can be anticipated. Can you unpack a bit of that for us?
Yeah. So first I'll explain the Ken-surrection bit, and then, elaborate a little bit more. So Ken-surrection is obviously a reference to the Barbie movie, as you noted. In the Barbie movie, Ken goes to the real world where men run everything. He returns to the feminist utopia of Barbie land, and he wants to remake it into a patriarchy. But in order to do that, the Kens need to ratify a new constitution because the one they have, right, has actually created this feminist utopia. And so I suggest that when the Republican appointees on the Supreme Court embraced originalism and overruled Roe versus Wade, they effectively engaged in their own Ken-surrection by remaking the U.S. Constitution, the one we have, into a Ken-stitution, one that only cared about the views of the white men who drafted and ratified the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment, in the 1800s. And so that's the Ken-surrection bit of, these justices basically remaking our law so that our country is certainly, never has been a feminist utopia, but is going to be way more like the patriarchy that the Kens envisioned in the Barbie movie.
One could say that you're even being generous there. I mean, and again, you're serving it up. I mean, because if you think about it, I mean, they're actually not being loyal to the reconstructed Constitution at all, right? Like they're not engaging with any of that history whatsoever, why we have birthright citizenship to begin with. They're not engaging with, the 13th Amendment and its abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude. They're not engaging. I mean, and here's what's interesting, which is that it's not like the court can't do that. The day before Dobbs, there's Bruin, and Justice Thomas is all over slavery in Bruin. He's like, let's give a prologue to it. Let's understand Black male bodily autonomy. Let's understand that Black men need guns in order to be fulfilled in their full rights and their full recognition. And that without that, then basically we're just kind of placing back Black men back to Jim Crow era and to slavery. So it's not like the court can't recognize that version of history. It just chose not to do so the next day in Dobbs.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think the third chapter of the book, which is about voting rights and race, really focuses on how the court over time, not just this court, but previous courts, have dimmed the lights and the promise of Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments by adopting this overly narrow view about what Reconstruction did and what it was about, and in some ways maligning Reconstruction, suggesting that there are certain aspects of Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were driven by this irrational hatred toward the South rather than, a recognition of what is actually needed to ensure, the civil rights of individuals who had just been freed from slavery, and what is necessary to retain civil rights today. And so, yes, the court has absolutely been selective in how it has approached the Reconstruction Amendments. both when it comes to voting rights and race, also when it comes to individual rights like abortion and reproductive freedom. And that's part of why, I, in the book, try to identify what is the ideological vision, the substantive vision that is underlying their views of the Constitution, which certainly don't seem just to be drawn from the text and the history.
So, Leah, as we begin to wrap up, one could say that, wow, what's been served up is something that is bleak. You even say that in the conclusion, okay, you've turned to the bleak. But that's not where it ends, because you give a vision towards what can be done. And I actually think that there's a lot to be said for sitting with that which is a bit bleak and sitting with that which actually tells the story, which is what you've done across a series of ways. Let's look at this. Let's turn the kaleidoscope such that we're honest and such that we can move beyond what has been some of the propaganda that we've digested about ourselves. And so as we turn to that space of change, what does that look like for you? And I have to give a plug out because you talk about Legally Blonde as well. So yeah, what does change represent?
Yeah. So I think part of what I was hoping to accomplish in the book was to tell a story to make clear how badly we need to fight, right? To get people agitated and want to fight, to want to do something. And part of why I wrote the book in the tone that I did, about the Ken-surrection and with all the shade, is to try to make that fight fun, right? Going to protests can be fun. Shouting, fuck the man, damn the man, right? That can be fun. And so part of what I want to do is tell the story in a way that makes people want to engage in that fight. And that fight is winnable. It is not just about the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, where Elon Musk poured in more than $10 million, right? And still did not manage to buy that seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It's also about the Michigan Supreme Court, which has undergone a radical transformation over the last 15 years. And so when people put in the work, when they educate themselves, when they educate others, when they are willing to go to protests, to knock on doors, to register people to vote, to help other people vote, that is how change happens. And yes, it is easier to do and affect change at the state and local level. It takes more time and there are more obstacles at the federal level. But the other option is basically giving up and going home. And at least for me personally, just letting these guys win is not an option. And so at the end of the book, I kind of put the challenge in terms of Legally Blonde, where I say, the professor is asking, if you're going to let one prick ruin your life, you're not the girl I thought you were. And here it's if you're going to let one court ruin your country, you too are not the person I thought you were. And so it's an invitation to fight and to figure out how you can fight, because we all have different contributions we can make.
Leah Litman, this is a marvelous book. Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. Leah Litman is the co-host of the award-winning super podcast, Strict Scrutiny. Leah, thank you for joining me, and I can't wait for the next time that we share company.
I agree. Thank you so much, Michelle. It is always a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Guests and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. I want to thank each of you for tuning in for the full story and engaging with us. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, where we'll be reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. For more information about what we discussed today, head to MsMagazine.com and be sure to subscribe. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America and being unbought and unbossed and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever it is that you receive your podcast. We are ad-free and reader-supported. Help us reach new listeners by bringing this hard-hitting content in which you've come to expect and rely upon by subscribing. Let us know what you think about our show, and please support independent feminist media. Look for us at MsMagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. And if you want to reach us, please do so. Email us at ontheissues@MsMagazine.com. We do read our mail. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Michelle Goodwin and Kathy Spiller are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Roxy Zoll, Oliver Hogg, and also Allison Whelan. Our social media content producer is Sophia Panagrahi. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Natalie Holland, and music by Chris J. Lee.